Welcome to Learn at Work, a webinar series presented by the journal Work, a journal of prevention, assessment, and rehabilitation. I'm Karen Jacobs, the moderator, and I'm the founding editor of the journal. I'm delighted that you could join us today. I'm going to turn the webinar over to our speaker, Garry Gray. Garry, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Jacobs, for inviting me to provide this webinar today. My name is Garry Gray, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Victoria in Canada. I'm in the sociology department. However, I'm a criminologist, trained in both criminology and sociology. I also teach qualitative research methods. Before joining the university, I was at Harvard Law School at a Center for Ethics, examining behavioral ethics inside organizations. And prior to that, I was at the Harvard School of Public Health, looking at safety culture inside hospitals, different industries, and including the trucking industry. So that's where the research stems from today, is my time as a postdoctoral fellow at the Harvard School of Public Health. So the title of my talk today is A Bird's Eye View of Driving Safety Culture. And what I'm really trying to capture, not just in this paper, but in the research that I did with truck drivers, is to provide a voice for truck drivers, to try to really tap into their everyday experiences and try to examine what we can learn from that. And that is often the goal of qualitative methods, is trying to understand the lived experiences of our participants. So the research today was not based on a particular survey or a scale or anything like that, although there is research we've done like that. But what these interviews were sitting down with truck drivers in truck stops in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and in New York, and having a conversation about various aspects of life as a truck driver and different things they experience. And so today's paper will focus on their experiences of basically car drivers near them. But before I get more into the methodology and the findings, I just wanted to put out there the broader public health aspects of looking at motor vehicle fatalities. Often, especially given that I'm in criminology, we talk a lot about homicide and robbery. But I just put some stats up there. They fluctuate year to year, but the message is still the same, and is that motor vehicle fatalities are astronomical in comparison to homicide death rates. So if you look at the crime rates, they're usually measured in per 100,000. I took three very high states in the U.S. at their homicide rate, 11.9 in Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri. But if you look at their motor vehicle death rates, it's still double, triple in some aspects. Even if you look at the very low homicides rate states, you still see that their motor vehicle fatalities is incredibly high. And if you think about inside workplaces, the motor vehicle death rate is much more higher. And of course, with truck drivers, they're lone workers, so they're on the road. So the data on that becomes a little more complex. And you can see below in the United States, generally on average, these statistics change, but 12 deaths per 100,000. And globally, motor vehicle fatalities is just a very 20 deaths per 100,000, and this, of course, will fluctuate in different places. Now, one of the aspects of when conducting interviews with the truck drivers that I'll explain more in the methods part, but a sense of a message that came over is sometimes how truck drivers are perceived in the media. And often when we do see images, they're often what we're seeing on the screen now. There's a major accident. Sometimes there'll be a very sensational case, and that'll dominate the media discourse. And people sometimes are scared of truck drivers or fearful when they're on the road. But there is this perception that the truck driving or the truck itself is dangerous somehow. And I think that needs to be interrogated a bit further, and especially when you're talking to truck drivers, because quite honestly, truck drivers are often thinking about safety of you and the car drivers all the time. And so what I found fascinating when talking to so many truck drivers was just all the different things they do in everyday practice to try to keep people around them safe. So they're constantly navigating their behaviors to adjust to our behaviors. But we're actually kind of oblivious to our behaviors when we're on the road. And this is frustrating to a lot of truck drivers. And so you can imagine their feelings when they're there's a negative portrayal constantly and of them. And so this is to try to take a step back and say, what are things that we can learn? What's going on here? Clearly, the consequences of accidents between, say, motor vehicles, motorcycles, or I just have cars versus trucks here, the consequences, no matter who's at fault, is clearly for the people in the cars. 90%, 97% of those killed are often the occupants of the car. Truck drivers do die as well, but when there is an accident, the negative outcome will affect the people that are hitting the truck, whether it's their fault or not their fault. But this is the point I think is critical to look at, is what we don't often hear about, is that car drivers themselves play a significant role in accidents between cars and trucks. So even though we often hear about the truck drivers' behaviors, we don't hear enough about our behaviors, or people with motor vehicles or four-wheelers or motorcycles, or how we're behaving around trucks, because often we're doing things that are contributing to these accidents. And so if that's the case, then obviously we need to share that information. People need to realize that, but we often can see how can we create situations that are going to decrease accidents. So if we take a situational routine sort of activities approach and we say, okay, well, maybe we can decrease opportunities to engage in these behaviors. And if we decrease people's behaviors, then hopefully we'll decrease accidents. So really this is focused on ways we can decrease our opportunities to have an accident with a truck. So it's really looking at what can we do when we're driving around trucks to decrease our risk. And when we do that, we first have to take a step back further and be cognitive of our own cognitive dissonance and our own implicit biases, because we often think we can handle it. And all drivers feel that, they can do things, but they often don't think other drivers can do things. So people often say they know someone who drives in an unsafe way. They see this, but they themselves are often more careful than other drivers. You see this with distracted driving as well, whereas people talk about how they feel very unsafe to see the person driving the car texting and driving, and they think that's very dangerous. But yet, over half of those same people will still feel that when they do that, texting and driving, somehow they can manage it. So there is sort of this implicit bias that we have to work through to help people realize that, they need to change their behaviors, and maybe they can't manage it. Maybe they can't multitask as easy as they think they can. And that right there itself is a whole stream of research and the difficulties of trying to have people realize that. Now, another aspect I think that's important here is to think about the intersection of public health and workplace safety. As I mentioned, truck drivers are lone workers, so they are sort of in that intersection. For them, being on the road is their workplace, and it is a public health concern. For us, we may be part of our job, but for most people on the road, you're going from A to B, and so we might consider a public health concern. So sometimes when we're talking about public health, you may or may not hear more about occupational health and safety or workplace safety. They're often sometimes separated or siloed, but there is this intersection that needs to be considered more closely, especially when we're talking about lone work. So for car drivers, or people on four-wheelers, as truck drivers often refer to them, often worry about the presence of trucks during their commute. So we're thinking of this public health concern. As I have on the slide there, the truck drivers are constantly negotiating risks that nearby car drivers face, and that's their workplace safety issue. And I really think that part with the truck drivers is something we don't hear enough about. It's something we need to hear more about. Speaking with truck drivers, it's something they all individually face. They become frustrated with. They wish that people understood that. Often they realize people don't understand it. So they're constantly feeling that they're looking out for our safety, but perhaps not being appreciated for those actions. And so a research question I had looked at was, how do we capture or analyze and translate routine truck driver knowledge in a way that potentially increases safety for both working truck drivers and nearby car drivers? So different areas of research, we're thinking about what's the tacit knowledge or the routine activities or that truck drivers possess they do it every day. They may be thinking about, but other times they may just do it habitually, so they're not always thinking about it. So how can you get into those types of conversations where you can sort of learn about these everyday present things that are going on? Now, as I mentioned, I had done interviews, interviews with 158 different truck drivers. And these interviews were not just about the topic we're talking about today. They were about how long they've been driving, their experiences with either as a company driver or as a owner operator driver, when they're dropping off trucks, near miss accidents, road safety, compliance with regulations, rules, a lot of different issues we touched upon. Slide showing a little glimpse into who they were. There were 128 company drivers from approximately 68 different companies, so quite a range across, and 30 were owner-operator drivers. You can see the majority were in the Northeast, often New York, Pennsylvania, Maine, Massachusetts, those types of areas. But you can see that there are truck drivers represented from across the United States and also 6.4% from Canada. And you can see that the majority were long-haul truck drivers, but many were regional and some were local. The average age at the time of the interview was 47.9 years old. The majority of the sample was male, 98%. The average years of experience for each truck driver that was interviewed was 16.3 years, so it's quite a bit of experience. The average number of miles each truck driver stated that they drive each week was 2,500. And so when I'm thinking about tacit knowledge and what can we learn from everyday lived experience, I just combine that and go, wow, that's like 400,000 miles a week, 20 million miles per year. So that's sort of the tacit knowledge we're trying to tap into here to gain a bit more perspective on these interactions between truck drivers and cars. During the interviews, in relation to this particular topic today, truck drivers were asked to list their top 3 common unsafe actions they observed car drivers doing in close proximity to their trucks. And so this solicited 474 different observations that were given by the 158 truck drivers. And then after they had listed 3, and some only listed 3, but they were asked, can you think of any other unsafe actions by motor vehicle drivers near your trucks? And that solicited another 229 observations. So in total, we had a sample of 703 different observations on truck drivers' observations of unsafe or risky driving behaviors near their trucks. Now, with those 703 observations, we coded them. I had a research assistant. We both coded simultaneously, then met, trying to engage inter-rater reliability to see if we were coding the same. If not, what could we do, how we were looking at it. So we're very systematic in that regard. You could read more in the paper about that. In terms of our data analysis, we did use computer-assisted software to make it more systematic and transparent in that regard. So you could look more into the paper if you'd like to read more about the methodology. And again, the aspect of this talk is trying to give voice to the truck driver experience. I've been a part of a lot of projects in different mixed methods where we're asking truck drivers or our participants in general to sort of give their experience on maybe perhaps a scale of 1 to 5 or 10, and we have maybe perhaps a theory we're trying to test or something, and that's fine, that's great research, but qualitatively, you also maybe want to think about, well, what are things that we have no idea what's going on? So that was really the motivation behind this, is just to sit down, talk to truck drivers, learn from these experiences, do these in-depth qualitative interviews. And I'll be quite honest, I learned a ton. I have changed my driving behaviors when I'm around trucks. And some of the terms truck drivers would use you'd almost be embarrassed. What do you mean by that? Because you could tell it was a common term in the field. And that's sometimes what we call, in qualitative terms, an experience near concept. It means a term that someone in their day-to-day life or workplace, it's just normal for to use that. But academics, we like to create these experience distant terms that sort of capture that reality. So we wouldn't talk necessarily about maybe your experiences with a driver near you. We'd we talked maybe about the concept of safety culture or safety climate or things like this. So I was trying to get it down to a level where you're capturing that as experience, near concepts, in a way that you can then use that knowledge to potentially educate the public more and help truck drivers too. I can only imagine how frustrating it would be to continually have these experiences and people not understanding what's going on. So a few quotes here just in regards to sort of the idea of thinking of truck drivers in sort of this bird's eye view. They do sit up high. They do see things we can't see. As this one truck driver for Virginia noted, naturally we can see down into the car, not being perverted. We just sit up so high, it's easy to look down. And in fact, you're starting to see in different cities, I know Toronto does this periodically, where police officers now will drive around on buses and look down because they can see into the cars if maybe they're trying to crack down on distracted driving or something like that. Another driver from Missouri noted, I see more texting now in cars. They normally have it down low, but I can see it from above in the truck. So for anybody out there who is sneaking their texting and driving, the truck drivers are noticing it. Another one from Alabama wrote, people reading, getting dressed while driving, putting on their pantyhose and makeup, you'd be surprised what we see. And so that is, I think, an important aspect. What do you see, and what can we learn from that? Now, out of those 703 observations, periodically there would be a comment that basically the truck driver, you could tell, was attributing motivation to the driver. And so when the difficulty of motivation is, unless you're absolutely in someone's head, do you really know exactly what caused them to do that? And even ourselves, given the research on implicit bias and things between attitudes and behavior, sometimes our behaviors are quite not in line with our motives. But in this case, this was, again, after all of these millions of driving experiences and hours and miles that are put on the road, truck drivers are saying, in everyday practice, you can kind of see what's going on. So occasionally they provide a motive for the risky driving behavior. So coded that and noticed that there was a pattern there, that for some of the behaviors, the truck drivers felt that the driver was purposely taking the risk. So they're speeding, they're doing something they know it's wrong. It's clear that there's something, that it's a purposeful action on the part. And then the other part is not paying attention. So it's a little more difficult to provide a cost-benefit type analysis in the idea of what's purposeful. And so if you're moving away, if you're not paying attention, I mean, that could be, some might argue, you're purposely choosing to take risks because you're not paying attention. But not paying attention, as we know, if anyone who's sat in a classroom with students all on their phone, it's not that the student doesn't want to learn. It's just there is this culture we have now where people are constantly distracted, whether it's through their phones, media, anything. So this idea of not paying attention attributes a different level of motivation to sort of the driver's risky behavior. And the last one I find really important, it's that the truck drivers, even though they might be frustrated by the actions they're seeing, they're understanding that those drivers lack knowledge of the risks. In other words, they don't even know what they're doing is unsafe, and yet they're continuing to do it. And that's one part I think can probably be frustrating for truck drivers on the road, but I think that's an area where we could learn a lot, because that's the area where I say after I was done with my interviews, I changed my behaviors of how I drove around trucks, because I didn't know all the local knowledge that truck drivers knew, and now I've been learning about it and I've adjusted my behavior. So it doesn't mean that when we become aware of something, we're automatically going to change our behaviors, but it is a starting point. We do need awareness, and awareness does not always lead to practice, but at least we're aware. And then perhaps later we purposely choose or not to choose to engage in those behaviors. So anyways, when we think about these three, if we go here, purposely taking risks, just to give a few quotes, truck driver from Idaho noted, they try to get in ahead of you, always trying to beat the truck by passing you before you exit. And that term, beat the truck, it came up quite a bit. And I think we can all relate to that when we're driving. You do sometimes, maybe you're going to go past someone and suddenly they just start speeding up. And you're like, why are you speeding up? You're being doing this speed the whole way. Now you're speeding up, and then so you slow down, and then they slow down. There's some psychology there that can explain that behavior, but it is something that truck drivers are constantly dealing with. That people are constantly trying to get ahead of them. And another truck driver noticed the purposefulness, just this impatience drivers have, trying to beat the truck and get around you to get off the exit ramp, and how that can be risky, especially if there's not a lot of room for the exits. And structurally, roads look different in different states, even in Canada, the US, of how much room you have to exit or not exit. Some are very tight, some are longer, and that can play a significant role in terms of your safety. And then another truck driver noticed there's a lack of respect and just common decency. They speed up to get past you. So clearly this person was feeling a bit more frustrated and feeling the purposefulness is associating disrespect to it as well. In regards to not paying attention, a trucker from California noted they don't pay attention on the phone reading, get distracted, then they swerve into other lanes. Another truck driver noted not focusing, cell phone, tending to kids, too many distractions. And I imagine that's something families can probably relate to, because you could think of distracted driving. You may not think of, taking your eyes off the road to deal with your child, or maybe drinking a coffee or sandwich, or all these other aspects that can be distracting. That is just not to do with the cell phone. And then another truck driver noticed talking on the phone, not paying attention. So clearly we see this as a theme throughout. But when it comes to lack knowledge of risks, one truck driver from Canada noted, in driver training, you don't get truck license without the car license, but people in cars are not trained with trucks. And I don't know about everyone else's experience who'll be listening to this talk, but I know for myself, yes, I was never trained with trucks. I even took an advanced driving program. We just went on the highway and you just sort of figure things out, but there was never much training on that. And I think these programs are popping up here and there and in different states and different areas, but they're not concise across, and overall people do lack that understanding with trucks. So there is a bit of a contradiction there. Another truck driver from New York commented, people do not realize what's involved in trucking. They think the truck can stop as quickly as a car, move into another lane. And I do think people probably do think that. It's obviously one of the things I thought, because I often didn't think about that when passing truck. You think it's common sense. When someone tells you, you're like, yeah, that's common. Now I see it as common sense. But people in their everyday behaviors, unless they're told or they understand that, it may not yet be common sense for them. And then another truck driver just noticed total ignorance. I think at least one day of truck safety should be included in driver's education courses. So you can see here the truck drivers really wanting more training, not just for truck drivers, but for people who are driving around them. They want everyone on the road to have a better understanding of what's involved with truck drivers, how they operate, how they're not able to stop as quickly. And so I believe those motivations are important when looking at the various risky practices people do. And so out of the 703, I created a top 20 unsafe driving behaviors that car drivers do according to truck drivers, and ranked them 1 to 20, listed the type of risky driving behavior, the number of observations, like how many times a different truck driver mentioned this, and then the attributing motivation, if there was a general trend of what truck drivers, why they felt people were engaging in that. So rather than put all 20 down, I'm just going to put the first 2. And there's a reason for that, because the first one, driving in the trucker front nose zone. This is a term I imagine anyone in the trucking industry or any truck driver would just think is common sense. I do not believe this is local knowledge among most car drivers. Most do not understand what is a front nose zone and these nose zones. In fact, most people I've ever talked to have had no idea what I'm talking about until I tell them, well, actually, the number one thing truck drivers say that we do that is dangerous around them is we drive in their nose zones. And so people don't understand that. And you can see the truck drivers know that. That's why they've attributed the motivation as a lack of knowledge. So for those who aren't familiar, there's this diagram that you'll see illustrating where are the nose zones that basically we should try to avoid staying out of, or if we are in there, to not spend too much time in there. And there's good reason, because 1/3 of all crashes between the cars and trucks are involving car drivers in these nose zones. And so you can see the four different parts. And the terms that were originally described in the interviews were safe space, break space. I think one of the first interviews, the truck driver was talking about my safe space. And we hear safe space is talked about in various different contexts now in society. But for the truck driver, the safe space is immediately these areas, in particular the front nose zone. And that one came up quite a bit because, of course, it had to do more with the braking space. So the front nose zone was clearly the number one thing that was concerning truck drivers the most. As this one truck driver, Virginia, was quoted as saying, cutting us truckers off, pulling over in front of us, and then slowing down. They jump in front of our safe spot. They think we're giving them space, and then they cut in front of us. But really, it's our brake safe space. So over and over, there's this pattern being described of how cars would pull in, trucks would slow down because they're in that no zone, and they know if something happens, they are not going to be able to stop, and they're going to hit that car. But now there's a space, their safe spot, their brake safe space, and then people would take that as an opportunity to jump in, and it's this ever-ending cycle of problems. In fact, one truck driver described a situation where a person cut in front of him, and he could see, because he's got the bird's eye view, that they're stopping up in front, cut in front of him. He didn't have time to adjust. He tried to immediately create that safe space. This person put on her brakes. He ended up hitting the back of her car, and when the police came, he was given the charge and the ticket. And you could see how defeated this truck driver was telling this story. And I'm like, well, didn't the police officer know about this? And he said, I don't. He goes, he doesn't know. He doesn't understand. And it was just this. Even sometimes the police didn't realize that, that this violation of space was an issue. And so again, we're even thinking with law enforcement, I don't think there's any setup people watching this behavior, and yet it's the number one thing the truck drivers say is concerning them. And again, another quote, they pass me, drive in front of me, slow down. Truckers are taught to leave enough space. Cars use it as an opportunity to get in. And I think that last quote, for those who do lack the knowledge, we're probably self-reflecting and thinking, yeah, that's probably me. And I'll be honest, that was probably me before I did this research. And now when I'm passing, every time I'm thinking about the safe zones, brake space, and I'm like, is it enough now? And I'm trying to create that because I'm aware of this situation. But this is a part where I think that there could be a lot more knowledge put out there, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. And of course, it has to do with the braking capability in trucks. Again, for truck drivers, this is probably common sense. And again, for us, car drivers, it sounds like common sense when you tell us, but when we're actually doing it, before you told us, we just were not thinking about that. And this led to one truck driver noting, they cut in front of you when traffic is ahead, it's coming to a stop. They don't know truck cannot stop that quickly. They cut into your safe braking zone. So again, the term safe braking zone, safe space, no zones, front zones, is language that's used in the everyday local experience of a truck driver. And one more quote, cutting in front of you, not leaving enough distance. If something happens in front of them, the truck may not have room to stop. And again, this is just a theme that came over and over. And so it's why I wanted to not list top 20 right away, because I thought then you get distracted by the other 18 reasons. And I thought, well, this no zone stuff is a stuff that is probably the most interesting thing about the findings here, because it's stuff that we're not talking about that often. And so that was the front no zone. But then, of course, there's the back no zone. And I think following too closely, people do this all the time. I mean, car drivers do this to car drivers. Everyone does this, but this can be also problematic because unlike a car driver, we can often see the person tailgating us really closely, and we're like, oh, if I have to hit the brake, they're going to hit me. But with a truck driver, they may not even see you. And so as you notice, this popped up, one truck driver from Washington noting they get too close to our back. We can't see them in the mirror. So there's a structural aspect of the truck. Like, they don't know you're there. And I find this quote, it's kind of humorous. It's interesting. It says quite a bit, but they say the cars act like ticks. It's a psychological thing. They get right up behind the truck, they get up real close, and they just stay there. It makes no sense. And I sometimes think about this in terms of, yeah, people do that. And then you're like, do I ever do that? And we probably do. Maybe we don't want it for some reason. There's some car, maybe for some people who are speeding, they're like going to go behind the speeding car. But for whatever reason, they do kind of get up close for some reason, they do kind of act like a tick. So I think this is another one that all of us should self-reflect and look at our own implicit bias on that and say, do we do that? And it's possible we do. We're just not thinking about it. But hopefully after when you're hearing about this, you don't want to be a tick. So top 20 unsafe driving behaviors, if there's anything from the top 20 before you see them, is to realize the importance of these front nose zones. They're not as splashy as some of the other things you hear about, but it's probably the most important and probably the biggest contribution we could make here. Now, for the third one, people on their phones. And again, attributing motivation is not paying attention. This was obviously something that came up. It's something that dominates the literature. It's something, depending on where you are, you see it constantly. For myself, it's becoming much more policed here where I live in British Columbia, Canada. People still do it, but I recently went to a conference in Florida, and everybody I walked by seemed to be on their phone, and they had recently passed a law there, but still, it was quite prevalent. And you can see with the truck drivers here talking about the dominance of people being either on the phone or texting. And you can see how just the numbers there, how prevalent that was. And of course, there were other aspects, people reading, people apparently on their computers too, as that's kind of, maybe I'm trying to imagine myself do that, but I guess people do that. Personal grooming, tending to children, a whole pile of other different things that they have observed people being distracted of. But clearly the most important there, the texting and being on the phone. And that is something that is a serious issue in society right now. And so when we do look at the top 20, I've just put up the top 10, then I'll put up the whole list. We see followed by number 4, following the truck close, improper lane changes, exiting, merging, texting while driving, driving in truck or blind spots, speeding. And then we have the whole list, lack of turn signals, reading computers, passing trucks on the right side, personal grooming, driving too slow, all these other distractions that were there. And looking at the different types of motivations that the truck drivers attribute to them. And so I think this is an interesting slide. It does, again, for anybody who's trying to put a message out there about distracted driving, clearly this study supports that. It is a common thing that truck drivers observe, are dealing with, are monitoring. But I think more interesting is the thing we don't always hear about is these no zones and how important they are, especially given that we know so many accidents are in those no zone areas. And so that's a big area where we could decrease opportunities to have a risk of engaging in an accident. So that's something I think that could have once we increase awareness of the front nose zones, and hopefully, unlike distracted driving, when we increase awareness, we have to deal with implicit biases and these other aspects. Hopefully, if we increase awareness of the front nose zones, back zones, people will, I can drive in the front nose zone. I don't know if people are going to think that as well. They might think, whoa, they could just slam into me if I hit the brake, so maybe I should be out of here. Now, there's often a so what question. So why is this research important? And personally, I think for the people who are listening to this, who are in the field, who are truck drivers themselves, I think they're going to come up with some great suggestions. They may already have great suggestions. And so for myself, though, what I'm taking from this is I'm kind of looking at those motivations. So, and this could perhaps be my combination of public health and criminology. In other words, how can we change behaviors? So for the first one, if we assume people are purposely risk-taking, so we assume a cost-benefit analysis, the corresponding theory with that would be a deterrence model of trying to increase the certainty, celerity, and severity of punishment. So perhaps we could think of more greater measures of enforcement might be required. Now, whether that will work or not, but if the motivation is people are purposely engaging for that, then perhaps there should be more enforcement in these certain areas. Now, for the not paying attention, this is something that different provinces and states and municipalities are struggling with, different experiments, like, as I mentioned, the police in Toronto being on the bus looking down, how to navigate that. You'll see fines, you'll see awareness campaigns. So here, perhaps higher levels of enforcement. Some people might hear that and go, there should be a lot more enforcement. But I think for sure, if whatever your position is on the level of enforcement, you probably think that public health campaigns should continue, and perhaps even workplace safety training, making it more sort of institutionalized in workplaces. Because again, people have these implicit biases where they think they can navigate these multitasking issues and not pay attention and still perform in the same way. And the research continually bears out, it doesn't show that, but people are biased implicitly and through cognitive dissonance and various aspects like that. So there could be different approaches, and there are different approaches people take, and I'm sure people have different opinions around that. But in terms of the lack of knowledge, this is a tricky one. I say if people really don't know, but should they know? There's often, is it negligence? Ought you have known? There's different aspects in law of your responsibility. So I put temporarily the same level of enforcement, and I completely think that I would respect disagreement either way on this one, because I often do a lot of work in regulation and compliance, and there's no consensus on this. People have different views. But what I put forth here is perhaps temporarily same level of enforcement combined though with public health campaigns and workplace safety training on dangers of truck no zones, and then proceed with more enforcement, because right now there is a lack of awareness. So when we go up the scale to not paying attention, people hear that distracted driving is bad. They know they shouldn't be on their phone or text. They're still doing it. And so they're not paying attention. They're not having the same cost-benefit approach, but they are aware, at least of the research. They may still think they can manage it, but at least it's out there, the dangers and the stats and the risks. Whereas right now with the no zones, people really don't know. So many people have no idea that that's an issue. And people are changing their behavior. So before I did this project, I didn't know everything about these no zones and all what was taking place. Now I do, and I've changed my behavior, so I've made a choice in that. But I can see so many people don't. So I do think that having these public health campaigns, but also workplace safety training, and maybe even in schools, like just even in driver's education, you could imagine, and some I'm sure do, but having this much more institutionalized in terms of training and approaches. So the presentation I provided you today is available in our journal here of work, Bird's Eye View of Driving Safety Culture, Truck Drivers' Perceptions of Unsafe Driving Behaviors Near Their Trucks. I have done other work. I just put a couple titles up there if you're interested in looking at some of these two other papers. One involves more experiences of workplace violence among truck drivers, and another one looks at the role of regulation and compliance and how people interpret rules. So you could think about the driving hour regulations and maybe some safety issues around that and how truck drivers experience that. So if you're interested in anything further that I've done, please feel free to email me. And so that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Garry, thank you so much. That was so interesting. And I do want to comment that I am driving much differently after reading your article. I think I'm driving in a much more safe manner. So we have many people online, David, Heidi, Melinda, and Sue. Sue, hi. We always love having you join. I'm going to release the microphone, and if you'd like to ask a question directly, you can do that. Let me see if I can let you all say hello. And as I release your microphone, feel free to ask a question to Garry. Garry, I wanted to ask, I'll start the questions off. What's next for you? You know, what do you think is the next big topic that you want to address? Garry, I think you were muted. So if you want to address that question, that would be great.
Hello. Yes, sorry. I think I was muted. I did hear the question, and I'm assuming
great.
Based on the technology I'm looking at, you can now hear me.
Okay.
So, yeah, and so for myself, I've I look at a lot of different areas of research, and often they're very different from one another. And so, but when I'm thinking of the areas of workplace health, I'm thinking about perhaps creating a book that looks more at the experiences of safety and taking some of the stuff with the truck drivers and their experiences and combine it with some other research I've done with factory workers and some collaborative projects I've done with people looking at safety inside universities, and other work I've done looking at safety inside hospitals, but trying to create that focus of trying to capture that everyday experience on the front line and how people are navigating that. And I know because in academia, we have different theories, we have different disciplines, methods, approaches, but if somehow we can sort of engage that front line more closely and learn from the people who are basically having experiences every day and not just focus on our experience distant theories and concepts, but really pay attention to the experience near lessons that people can teach us. For the lesson I've learned from truck drivers about no zones, in which I have changed my behaviors from conducting this research.
I'm hoping that people who listen to this webinar will do the same. Sue commented, and Sue's in the UK, really interesting. I didn't know much about this, and it will change the way I drive. So you've influenced another person with your research.
Excellent. And in many ways, I go back to those moments sitting in the truck stop talking to individual truck drivers who really just were kind and gave me their time, and some longer than others depending on how long how much time they had to kill. And thinking about, for some of them, really enjoying sharing this experience and being listened to and going, yeah, this is important. And then there's always this sort of guilt you feel as a researcher. Am I getting this research out quick enough? And I feel the guilt I have is I'm not getting this out quick enough. So in many ways, I'm just sharing the voice of people who shared their time with me, putting those voices together and put it out. So I'm glad to hear that some of the research I'm doing, people are changing behavior, but it is because I'm just listening to people in the field. And so if there's any message to be there, it should be thanking the truck drivers who took their time and shared their knowledge. They didn't have to do that.
Yeah, but that's you are the messenger, which is really important. You're acknowledging, what's going on, and you are having an impact. I was curious when you said that police officers are starting to be in buses or higher types of vehicles. Is that something that you're also noticing, or is that something that a truck driver reported to you?
That was something that I noticed by paying closer attention to news media. I'm constantly seeing what's going on, what's being reported. And so I teach in other areas too of institutional corruption. I look at ethics and different things that we're not always thinking about. And I always tell my students, and now that you've heard about this, you're going to notice these things in the media. You're going to pay attention when there's an article. I've done stuff on near miss accidents, and that's another thing. People happen to them all the time, but never really systematically thought about them. And so, so I mean, for reading about different ways they're trying to police distracted driving, I find that interesting, because I think the frustration is that they've gone beyond awareness. We're letting you all know. We're doing. Everybody should know now. Why are you still driving distracted? So you're having to be more creative, because it is difficult. People do hide the phones. That's why the truck drivers say we can see you. So, I'm not sure if the police were thinking about the truck driver in the situation, but they were clearly thinking about a bird's eye view. Like, we need to see different ways of what people are behaving inside the vehicles.
Yeah, to help make change, or to draw their attention to what they're doing. So we got a couple more comments here. Sue wrote, so how do you suggest that this be shared more widely?
Well, I think
webinar in your article, anything else?
Well, there in universities, we're constantly, this is something that's being more of a conversation. Kind of the historical model is we do research, we publish it in a peer-reviewed journal, and people may or may not read it. But I believe there's more responsibility and thinking about public scholarship. And clearly with Dr. Jacobs, what we're doing here with the Learn at Work webinar is creating sort of that format where to take an academic article and present it, and so anyone can hear it. So for myself, this is an important venue to do that. But I also think there's other ways you can approach. You can write op-eds. You can look at other media outlets that engage with topics. There's the conversation that's quite international. There's a whole host of different things you could do in that. And in fact, it is a project that I'm thinking more about public scholarship, how to get these messages out, because again, it goes back to me thinking of all these truck drivers who spent their time talking to me, and who's getting to hear their messages? Is it just other academics, or it should be everybody? So this is a challenge overall in academia.
Absolutely, absolutely it is. So one of the other things that I wanted to ask you, and this is another question, I think Heidi posted this one. Do you foresee insurance companies working to ensure these safety issues? Have you, investigated that area at all?
I have not, but I absolutely can see that, because often insurance companies, sometimes they play regulatory roles. There could be an insurance board. They could have closer relationships with government. In certain provinces in Canada, they do. I'm not sure about the different states across the U.S. And people may think is like what role? They were worrying about more surveillance, which could be a good concern. But what about these more educational campaigns or things like that? Or if, of course, there's the more punitive aspect, more points off your driver's license, things like that, higher rates. If you're approaching that sort of cost-benefit incentive model, that can be there. So I think there are a lot of different ways people are engaging this. I think it varies so much and so widely. Perhaps there is a conference out there and people are putting this together. I imagine there is someone doing that type of work, but it's not something I've examined deeply and fully. I've kind of more trying to just understand the lived experience and now how can you get those messages out. But that is absolutely like the next steps is how can we approach this? And I do think it should be part of driver education when people are going through.
I have to tell you, I was driving and got cut off by someone who's learning to drive. And I was thinking about your article, and I said, this is a near miss for me, but could you imagine if the student driver had just cut off a truck, what that would have looked like? So I do think, driver education is just critical.
Yes, and that seems like an easy thing to do, really, but it requires to get the knowledge out there.
So the last question that I was thinking or suggestion is, how about sending a letter to the editor of newspapers about this, or contacting a local magazine or radio station or podcast. I think that they would be extremely interested. So knowledge translation, this fabulous research that you did, published in a double-blind peer-reviewed journal. Now we've got this webinar, and maybe we just need to get it out to just the everyday person who listens to a podcast or reads a newspaper or radio, things like that. So that's what I would encourage you to think about doing as another step, because it's important. I felt your article was extremely powerful to me, and I know others did as well.
Well, thank you. And I also think, too, I'd put that out for anyone listening to this webinar as well, because people in different areas, in different parts of this field would have so many insights and ideas on how to do that. They may already be doing that. And so I did have my email up on the screen, so feel free to email me. And yeah, I'm more happy to have a conversation and try to engage it along the lines you're referring to.
That's great. And Sue, who's in the UK, said she's happy to share this on LinkedIn. And so Sue, you follow me anyhow, but go to the Work Journal's website, which is workjournal.org, and we'll have a link on there probably by next week, so you can do that. And Heidi McAlpine asked, how can occupational therapy practitioners assist and follow through? So Gary, I think you may know that I'm an occupational therapist besides a board
Mhm.
certified professional ergonomist. And occupational therapy practitioners are involved in driving rehab. Driving is an important, occupation for many, many people. Do you see any way that our profession might be able to assist you with some follow through on what you found in your study?
Oh, well, that's, yeah, I mean, that's you're absolutely correct. There's so many academic disciplines that are so applied and connected into the fields already. So, um, I mean, on the other hand, you may have so much knowledge about different things. You're like, what should I be sharing with people that I know? But yes, but these things often have to be more of they have to be shortened in many ways because people are distracted. They need the sound bite. So I think trying to get the narrative or the message out there, you have to think carefully about what can grab someone's attention and how can you convey a message really quickly, but it's still getting at that context. And if they want to learn more, they're going to look at more, but at least they're still getting that message. So I don't have a precise answer for you, but I think, I imagine some people listening are already probably thinking of some ideas along those lines.
Absolutely. Well, do you have any last thoughts before we conclude this webinar today?
I just like, yeah, again, I'd like to thank you for providing this outlet, and hopefully this sparks more interest from people listening, and maybe they have creative ideas that they're going to bring forward. And of course, just the everyday truck driver who's out there and going along the road, and if someone's listening and they actually spoke to me, then just thank you for sharing your experience. I want you to know that those experiences do matter, and we are trying to make changes and differences. And I know it can move very slowly in research, but we are trying to find ways to engage the public more quickly. So thank you.
Oh, Gary, thank you so much for a very stimulating presentation of your research and also this conversation afterwards. And everyone, thank you for joining us. Gary, will you share one more time your email just in case anyone would like to be in touch with you?
Yeah, it's gcgray at uvic.ca. So gcgray at uvic.ca.
Great, and thank you.
And
And yes, thank you very much for sharing that, Gary. And I'll
thank you.
thank everybody again for joining us on Learn at Work. Check out the Work Journal website, workjournal.org, and you'll get the listing of all of our 2020 Learn at Work webinars and also the ones from the past. I think you'll find them all very interesting. So thanks again.